57 BC. The Sambre River, Gaul. Julius Caesar's 10 legions are making camp, armor off, weapons stacked, completely unprepared when 330,000 screaming Gauls explode from the forest, 500 meters away. In the next 4 hours, Caesar will either lose the entire Roman army in Gaul or achieve the most spectacular comeback victory in military history. Think about those numbers. 50,000 Romans, half-dressed, scattered across a construction site, facing 330,000 warriors who've been waiting in perfect ambush. That's a 6-to-1 disadvantage at the exact moment when Roman discipline means nothing. Yet by sunset, 200,000 Gauls will be dead, and Caesar will have secured Rome's conquest of Western Europe. I'm about to reveal 3 things that will change how you see ancient warfare forever. First, the moment Caesar grabbed a shield from a dying soldier and charged into the collapsing front line himself. Second, why the Nervii, history's most fearsome tribal warriors, made the tactical mistake that sealed their extinction. And third, the Roman engineering decision made 2 hours before the battle that accidentally saved the entire army. But here's what makes this truly unbelievable. How did soldiers putting up tents transform into a killing machine in under 3 minutes? Why did Caesar's most veteran legion break and run while raw recruits held the line? How did a general who couldn't see half his army coordinate a counterattack that destroyed a nation? And why did the Nervii refuse every chance to retreat, choosing complete annihilation over survival? To understand how 50,000 men survived impossible odds and butchered an entire confederation, we need to go back to when Caesar first learned that the most dangerous tribe in Gaul was waiting for him with the largest army ever assembled against Rome. Spring, 57 BC. Julius Caesar had spent the previous year crushing Gaul's southern tribes, and now he was marching north with 10 legions, 50,000 of Rome's finest, to secure the northern frontier. But his scouts brought disturbing news. The Nervii, a Belgian tribe Rome knew almost nothing about, were assembling a coalition. These weren't the Gauls Caesar had fought before. Roman merchants who traded along the northern frontier spoke of the Nervii in whispers. They allowed no wine, no Roman goods, no foreign traders into their territory. They considered every comfort a weakness, and every weakness a betrayal. They'd executed their own chiefs for accepting Roman gifts. And now they were calling every tribe between the Rhine and the ocean to war. Caesar's intelligence network, the most sophisticated military espionage system in the ancient world, could tell him almost nothing useful. The Nervii didn't trade. They didn't negotiate. They didn't follow the normal patterns of Gallic tribal politics. Other tribes feared them. The Remi, Rome's only allies in the region, sent desperate envoys warning Caesar to avoid Nervii territory entirely. They described a people who practiced warfare like a religion, who trained for combat from childhood, who considered dying in battle the only honorable death. Here's what made the Nervii genuinely terrifying to Roman strategic thinking. Every other Gallic tribe Rome had encountered followed predictable patterns. They'd mass their warriors, charge in a mob, fight bravely but chaotically, then break when casualties mounted to around 20%. Standard tribal warfare. The Nervii were different. They fought in disciplined formations. They used combined arms tactics, infantry, cavalry, even primitive siege techniques. They'd conquered every neighboring tribe through methodical campaigns that looked uncomfortably Roman in their execution. The numbers reaching Caesar's headquarters made the threat explicit. The Nervii could field 60,000 warriors. Not farmers conscripted for a season, but professional fighters who trained year-round. Add their subject tribes and the coalition forming around them, and Caesar faced potentially 300,000 hostile combatants. Think about that for a second. Rome's entire military establishment across the empire numbered roughly 450,000 legionaries. Caesar was marching 10 legions, 1/9 of Rome's total military strength, into territory controlled by a tribal confederation that could theoretically field 2/3 of Rome's numbers. But here's what truly worried Caesar, though he'd never admit it in his dispatches to the Senate. The Nervii had home field advantage in the worst possible terrain. Their lands were endless forests broken by rivers and swamps. No open ground for Roman formations to deploy. No roads for Roman logistics. No cities to besiege or capture. The Nervii could attack when they wanted, where they wanted, and fade back into forests the Romans couldn't navigate. They could bleed Caesar's legions through ambush and attrition without ever committing to a set-piece battle Rome might win. Caesar's officers argued for a defensive strategy. Build fortified camps. Wait for the Nervii to come to them. Let the Gauls exhaust themselves on Roman fortifications. Safe, sensible, completely contrary to Caesar's nature. He'd come to Gaul to win glory and wealth, not to hide behind walls. So he made a decision that was either brilliant or suicidal, depending on what happened next. He would march directly into Nervii territory, force them to fight, and destroy them in a single decisive battle. What Caesar didn't know was that the Nervii were already planning exactly that. The numbers that reached Caesar's headquarters tent should have been impossible. The Nervii had convinced the Atrebates, the Viromandui, the Atuatuci, and a dozen smaller tribes to join them. Intelligence reports estimated the combined force at 330,000 fighting men. Caesar's officers thought the number was exaggerated. It wasn't. The Nervii had promised their allies something no Gallic tribe had ever offered before. Not plunder, not land, but the complete destruction of Rome's presence in Gaul. They would massacre Caesar's legions to the last man, then march south and drive every Roman back across the Alps. The entire confederation had sworn a blood oath. No retreat, no surrender, no prisoners. The Romans would be annihilated, or the Gauls would die trying. Let that sink in for a moment. 330,000 warriors. To put that in perspective, that's roughly equal to the entire population of Rome itself. Every man, woman, and child in the capital. The Nervii alone contributed 60,000 fighters. The Atrebates brought 50,000. The Viromandui added 40,000. The Atuatuci, famous for their skill with siege warfare, were marching with 30,000 men. Smaller tribes, the Levatsi, the Pleumoxi, the Gaiduni, each contributed between 5,000 and 15,000 warriors. The Confederation had been assembled in under 3 weeks. Here's what made this coalition unprecedented in Gallic history. Tribal alliances usually fell apart within days. Gallic chiefs competed for glory, argued over tactics, feuded over ancient grievances. Keeping even 2 tribes cooperating for a single campaign was nearly impossible. But the Nervii had done something revolutionary. They'd convinced every participating tribe to swear a religious oath before their druids. Break formation, retreat without orders, negotiate with Rome. Any of these meant not just death, but eternal damnation. The warriors believed it. More importantly, the chiefs believed it. The tactical implications terrified Caesar's staff officers. 330,000 men meant this wasn't just a tribal army. It was a migrating nation in arms. The logistics alone defied belief. That many warriors needed roughly 600 tons of food per day. They'd stripped their territories of grain, stores, driven tens of thousands of cattle and pigs with the army, organized foraging parties that swept the countryside like locusts. They could sustain this force for weeks, maybe months. A Roman army that size would have required 4 years of preparation and a supply train stretching back to Italy. But here's where it gets genuinely insane. The Nervii weren't planning a defensive campaign. They weren't going to wait for Caesar to come to them, fight from fortified positions, use their numbers conservatively. They were planning an ambush. 330,000 men, hidden, waiting to annihilate 50,000 Romans in a single afternoon. The scouts who'd been shadowing Caesar's column had already reported back. They knew his route. They knew his march formation. They knew exactly where the most vulnerable legions would be and precisely when they'd be most exposed. The Nervii had chosen the ground. They'd chosen the moment. And they were about to teach Rome that numbers, properly applied with surprise and commitment, could overcome even legendary Roman discipline. Caesar's legions were marching straight into the largest ambush in ancient military history. Caesar knew he was walking into a trap. The question was where and when it would be sprung. His 10 legions marched in a column that stretched for 15 kilometers, moving through dense forests and unfamiliar territory where visibility extended maybe 50 meters on either side of the rough dirt roads. The Nervii lands were a nightmare for Roman military doctrine. Everything Romans excelled at, formation fighting, engineering, coordinated maneuvers, required open ground and time to prepare. Here, forests pressed in from every side. Rivers cut across the line of march. The locals had vanished, taking their livestock and burning their own villages. Caesar was marching blind through hostile territory toward an enemy force 6 times larger than his own. And every day the forests grew thicker and the reports from his scouts more ominous. The pace of advance was brutal. Caesar pushed his legions to cover 25 kilometers per day, a punishing rate through hostile terrain. A standard Roman legion on the march occupied about 2 kilometers of road space when properly spaced. 10 legions, plus the massive baggage train carrying supplies, siege equipment, and camp followers, stretched that column to 15 kilometers from vanguard to rear guard. Think about that. The first legion and the last legion were 3 hours apart. If the Nervii attacked the front, it would take half a day for the rear legions to march forward to support them. Caesar's scouts were dying. Every morning, cavalry patrols rode out ahead of the column to probe the forests and track enemy movements. Every evening, fewer returned. The Nervii had their own scouts, warriors who knew every animal track and river ford in this region. They ambushed Roman cavalry in the dense woods where horses couldn't maneuver. Bodies were found stripped of armor, mutilated, left on the trail as messages. By the 5th day of March, Caesar had lost over 200 cavalry scouts. He was effectively blind. Here's what Caesar's officers were telling him around the command tent each night. Turn back. The Nervii were too numerous, the terrain too hostile, the intelligence too poor. They could return to winter quarters, request reinforcements from Rome, try again next year with better preparation. It was sound military advice. Caesar rejected it completely. Turning back now would hand the Nervii a strategic victory without fighting. Every tribe in Gaul would see that Rome could be intimidated. The coalition would grow larger. Next year, instead of 330,000 warriors, Caesar might face 500,000. So the march continued, deeper into Nervii territory, deeper into forests that seemed designed to swallow armies. The Romans moved through valleys where enemy positions on the ridgelines above could massacre them. They forded rivers where a few hundred defenders could hold up the entire column for hours. They made camp each night behind hastily dug fortifications, knowing that 330,000 Gauls could be watching from the darkness beyond the torchlight. On June 9th, 57 BC, Caesar's scouts reported a river ahead, the Sambre, open ground on the south bank, forest on the north. It looked like decent terrain for a camp. The legions would reach it by mid-afternoon tomorrow. What none of them knew was that 200,000 Nervii warriors were already there, hidden in that forest, waiting in perfect silence. The Roman column structure told you everything about their vulnerability. Caesar marched his legions in two groups. The first 6 legions, the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th, marched at the front. These were veteran units, hardened by the previous year's campaigns, disciplined and experienced. Behind them came the baggage train, an enormous serpent of wagons, pack animals, supplies, and camp followers stretching for kilometers. At the rear marched the 13th and 14th legions, the newest recruits, most of whom had never seen combat. This was standard Roman practice on the march. Put your best troops at the front to handle contact. Put your greenest troops in the safest position at the rear. Protect the supplies in the middle. On June 10th, 57 BC, this standard doctrine was about to get thousands of Romans killed. Each of those front 6 legions contained approximately 4,800 men at full strength. Though after a year of campaigning, most were down to around 4,200 effectives. That's still 25,000 veteran soldiers in the vanguard. Experienced men who'd fought through the Helvetii campaign, who knew how to form testudo formations under arrow fire, who could build a fortified camp in 3 hours and hold it against overwhelming odds. These were professionals, but professionals need 2 things to be effective: time and space. They were about to have neither. The baggage train was the real vulnerability. Picture 8 kilometers of slowly moving wagons hauled by exhausted oxen, stretching between the 2 halves of Caesar's army. Inside those wagons rode everything the legions needed to function: replacement weapons, armor, medical supplies, food stores, engineering equipment, the legions' pay chests. Camp followers, wives, merchants, slaves, walked alongside. At least 15,000 non-combatants mixed with maybe 2,000 legionaries assigned to guard duty. If the Nervii hit the baggage train, those guards would face impossible odds while trying to protect people who couldn't fight back. Here's what made this formation absolutely lethal in the wrong circumstances. Roman tactical doctrine assumed you'd have warning before contact. Scouts would report enemy positions. The column would halt. Legions would deploy from march formation into battle lines. The whole army would concentrate before engaging. Standard, sensible, proven through centuries of warfare. But it required one critical element: time. Specifically, it required about 30 to 45 minutes from first contact to full deployment. The Nervii scouts watching from the forests had calculated something the Romans hadn't. If they waited until the first 6 legions reached the Sambre River and began making camp, when soldiers would be scattered, armor off, weapons stacked, they could close the 500-meter gap from tree line to Roman position in under 3 minutes. The front legions would have 3 minutes to react. The baggage train would be hours away from any support. And the 13th and 14th legions at the rear? They'd be an hour's march from the killing ground. Caesar, riding with the vanguard on the morning of June 10th, was thinking about camp placement and supply distribution. He was reviewing tomorrow's march orders. He was planning how to bring the Nervii to battle on ground of his choosing. What he wasn't thinking about was that the Nervii had already chosen the ground, chosen the moment, and positioned 200,000 warriors in perfect ambush positions. At 2 p.m., the 7th Legion scouts reported they'd reached the Sambre River. Clear ground on the south bank, forest on the north. Perfect for a camp. Caesar gave the order that would nearly destroy his entire army: make camp. The Nervii had chosen their ground with terrifying precision. The Sambre River ran through a shallow valley with gentle slopes rising on both sides. The southern bank, where Caesar's legions would approach, offered clear ground perfect for a Roman camp. The northern bank rose in a gradual slope covered in dense forest. To Roman eyes, it looked like decent defensive terrain. A river barrier in front, open ground for deployment, forest for timber. It was perfect. But inside that forest, invisible from the Roman side, 200,000 Nervii and their allies waited in absolute silence. They'd been there for 2 days, not moving, not making fires, eating cold food and drinking river water they'd carried in. Gallic scouts had tracked Caesar's column for the past week, reporting his exact position every few hours. The Nervii knew Caesar would reach the Sambre on June 10th. They knew he'd see the clear ground and order his legions to make camp. And they knew the exact moment when the Romans would be most vulnerable. Think about what it takes to hide 200,000 men. That's not a war band. That's a nation in arms, packed into maybe 3 square kilometers of dense forest. Warriors stood shoulder to shoulder in clan formations, organized by tribe and family group. The Nervii held the center, 60,000 men in tight ranks. The Atrebates took the right wing with 50,000. The Viromandui held the left with 40,000. Smaller tribal contingents filled the gaps. Every man knew his position, knew his role, knew the signal to attack. The discipline required defied everything Romans believed about Gallic warfare. Tribal warriors were supposed to be undisciplined, emotional, incapable of waiting in formation. Yet here were 200,000 men who'd been motionless for 48 hours. No talking, no fires at night. They'd dig latrines hundreds of meters back in the forest to avoid the smell giving away their position. They posted sentries to watch for any warrior who might break discipline. The penalty for making noise or moving without orders was immediate execution. The Nervii meant it. At least 30 men had been quietly killed by their own chiefs for breaking silence. Here's what made the position genuinely brilliant. The forest edge sat exactly 500 meters from where the Romans would establish their camp perimeter. Close enough that charging warriors could cover the distance in under 3 minutes. Far enough that Roman sentries couldn't see movement in the shadowed tree line. The slope was gentle, maybe a 4-degree grade, which meant warriors could maintain full sprint speed all the way to contact. And the river was shallow, barely waist-deep at the crossing points the Nervii had scouted. No barrier at all. The Nervii chieftain, Boduanatus, had wargamed every scenario. If the Romans somehow detected the ambush early, his warriors would still have numbers. 4-to-1 advantage, even if every Roman formed up properly. If the Romans were caught making camp as planned, the advantage became overwhelming. Scattered soldiers, no armor, no formation, no time to organize. It would be a slaughter. At 2 p.m. on June 10th, Nervii scouts reported the 1st Roman Legion, the 7th, had reached the south bank and begun marking out the camp perimeter. Boduanatus gave a single order: wait for my signal. When half the Roman soldiers had removed their armor, when the camp construction was fully underway, when maximum chaos would result from the attack, then they would strike. The Romans had 90 minutes before 200,000 warriors erupted from the forest and changed the course of Western history. When a Roman legion made camp, it followed a procedure so standardized that any legionary could do it half asleep. First, a rectangular perimeter was marked out, roughly 500 meters by 600 meters for a single legion. Then the entire legion deployed in battle formation around the perimeter, while engineers and designated work parties dug a defensive ditch 3 meters wide and 2 meters deep. The excavated dirt was piled on the inner edge to create a rampart. Sharpened stakes were driven into the rampart top, creating a palisade. Only when these fortifications were complete did the legions stand down, remove armor, stack weapons, and begin pitching tents and preparing food. The whole process took 3 to 4 hours. It had kept Roman armies safe for centuries. On June 10th, 57 BC, it became the mechanism of near annihilation. Caesar's first 6 legions reached the Sambre at approximately 2 p.m. They saw the open ground, the river, the forest beyond. Caesar gave the standard order: make camp. The 7th and 8th legions, having arrived first, immediately began the procedure. At 2:05 p.m., surveyors marked the camp boundaries with stakes and rope. By 2:10 p.m., 8,400 men from both legions had deployed in defensive formation, 3 lines deep, shields locked, facing outward, while work parties began excavating the perimeter ditch. Think about what that meant. Roughly half of each legion's strength was standing guard in full armor. The other half was digging, hauling dirt, driving stakes. Standard, safe, exactly what the Nervii were waiting for. By 2:20 p.m., the procedure had progressed exactly as doctrine demanded. The 7th Legion's ditch was 1/3 complete. Soldiers were sweating in the afternoon heat, segmented armor, plates restricting their movement as they swung picks and hauled baskets of excavated earth. The guards standing formation were growing bored, watching an empty forest across a peaceful river. Nothing had threatened them. The 9th and 10th legions arrived and began marking their own camp perimeters adjacent to the first 2. The 11th and 12th legions were still approaching, their standards visible in the distance. Here's where it gets genuinely insane. At 2:30 p.m., the 7th and 8th legions had been working for 25 minutes. Their ditches were roughly half complete, deep enough to slow an attacker, but not deep enough to stop one. And here's the critical detail the Nervii had counted on. Roman doctrine said once the ditch reached 50% completion, the legion could begin standing down the guard formations. The perimeter was secure enough. Soldiers in the defensive line could remove their armor, stack their shields and weapons, and join the work. Parties to speed up completion. At 2:35 p.m., centurions in the 7th and 8th legions gave the order. First and second lines, stand down. Secure your equipment and report to work details. Across both legions, roughly 5,600 soldiers began unbuckling armor. Segmented plate came off first, the lorica segmentata that protected chest and back. Then the shoulder guards. Then helmets. Shields went into neat stacks. Gladi, the short swords that were Rome's primary killing tool, were piled beside them. Men stretched, relieved to be free of 30 kilograms of metal in the summer heat. They picked up shovels and joined the excavation. From the forest, 500 meters away, Boduignatus watched through the trees. Half the Romans were now without armor. Their weapons were stacked. They were scattered across a square kilometer, digging and hauling. The other 4 legions were still arriving, still disorganized. He raised his hand. 200,000 warriors tensed. At 2:30 p.m. precisely, he dropped his hand and screamed the attack order. The forest erupted. At 2:15 p.m., 6 Roman legions were scattered across a square kilometer of ground in various stages of construction. The 7th and 8th legions, furthest along, had dug about half their defensive perimeter. Soldiers were hauling dirt, driving stakes, laying out tent positions. The 9th and 10th legions were still marking their perimeter. The 11th and 12th had just arrived and were beginning to deploy. Armor was off. Shields were stacked. Swords were in piles. The soldiers were in work tunics, moving in the organized chaos of camp construction. The baggage train was still strung out along the road. Wagons pulled by exhausted oxen, camp followers resting in the afternoon heat. The 13th and 14th legions, the newest recruits, were an hour behind, still marching through the forest. And across the river, in the tree line 500 meters away, 200,000 Nervii and 130,000 allied warriors watched and waited for the signal. Let those numbers sink in. 25,000 Romans were actively working, digging, hauling, building. Maybe 5,000 were still in armor standing guard. But they were watching the wrong directions, scanning for threats from the flanks and rear, not expecting anything from the peaceful forest across the river. Another 5,000 were still approaching with the 11th and 12th legions, not yet in position. The rest, 9,000 soldiers with the 13th and 14th, were an hour's march away, completely unable to help. Against them, 330,000 Gallic warriors stood ready in perfect ambush positions, close enough to smell the Roman cooking fires. The tactical advantage was obscene. The Nervii had trained for this exact scenario. Their warriors knew to hit the Romans before armor could be donned, before weapons could be distributed, before formations could be established. They'd studied Roman camp-building procedures through their scouts. They knew the timing. They knew the vulnerabilities. They'd positioned their fastest runners at the forest edge, their veteran warriors in the second and third ranks to exploit the breakthrough, their cavalry on the flanks to cut off retreat. Caesar was at the center of the construction site, consulting with his engineers about the camp layout, completely unaware. His command staff was scattered, some supervising their legions, others dealing with the arriving baggage train, one checking on the approaching rear legions. No one was at combat stations, because no one expected combat. The last enemy scouts had been spotted 2 days ago. Intelligence suggested the Nervii were still assembling their forces somewhere to the north. Everything seemed normal. Here's what the Romans missed. The forest across the Sambre was too quiet. No bird calls, no animal movement, nothing. A forest that silent means something large is disturbing it. But Roman soldiers from Mediterranean climates didn't know northern European forests well enough to recognize the warning sign. The few who noticed dismissed it. The oppressive silence should have screamed danger. At 2:28 p.m., a Roman sentry on the 7th Legion's perimeter thought he saw movement in the tree line. He squinted, trying to make sense of shadows in the forest depth. Nothing. Probably a deer. He turned back to watch his assigned sector. At 2:30 p.m. precisely, Boduanatus screamed the attack order. 200,000 warriors exploded from the trees like a breaking dam, and the Romans had exactly 180 seconds before impact. At 2:30 p.m., the forest erupted. 200,000 Nervii warriors burst from the tree line in a coordinated wave that seemed impossible for a tribal army. They didn't charge in a mob. They ran in clan formations, organized wedges of 50 to 100 men, each moving with the discipline of trained soldiers. They hit the river at a sprint, barely slowing as they splashed through water that was waist-deep in the center. The distance from tree line to Roman perimeter was 500 meters. Running warriors can cover that in under 3 minutes. The Roman sentries, maybe 50 men per legion posted as lookouts, started shouting warnings. But 330,000 men make a sound like thunder, a roar that drowns out everything. Roman soldiers across the campsite looked up from their work to see a wall of humanity. Thousands of warriors in iron helmets and mail armor, painted shields, spears, and swords, screaming in 100 dialects as they ran. 3 minutes. That's how long the Romans had to react. 2:30 and 15 seconds. The Cornicans, legion trumpeters, began blowing the alarm call. Different legions used different signals. Some sounded assembly, others sounded battle stations, others just blew continuous blasts. meaning enemy contact. The result was acoustic chaos. Soldiers across the construction site dropped tools and started running. But running where? To their unit standards? To the weapon stacks? To the partially dug perimeter? No one knew. Officers were screaming contradictory orders. 2:30 and 45 seconds. The Nervii front ranks hit the river. The water was shallow, barely chest deep at the center, ankle deep near the banks. Warriors didn't break stride. They charged through, shields held high, weapons raised. The river crossing that should have slowed them to a crawl took maybe 20 seconds. Behind them, another 180,000 warriors were still pouring from the forest in an endless wave. The Romans watching from the camp could see no end to them. Here's what was happening simultaneously across the Roman position. In the 7th Legion sector, maybe 800 soldiers had managed to grab shields and swords and were forming rough clusters around there. Centurions, not proper formations, just knots of men trying to create some kind of defensive line. In the 8th Legion, a full cohort, 480 men, was still in armor from guard duty and forming up properly. They would be the only organized Roman unit when the Nervii hit. In the 9th and 10th Legions, total chaos. Soldiers scrambling for the weapon stacks, strapping on whatever armor they could grab, forming up with men from different centuries and different cohorts. Unit integrity was gone. 2:31 and 30 seconds. The Nervii were 200 meters out, still at full sprint, and the sound was physical. Thousands of feet hitting ground, thousands of voices screaming war cries, shields banging against armor. The Roman soldiers who'd managed to arm themselves could see individual warriors now. Paint, tattoos, the murder in their eyes. Caesar, caught in the center of the camp with no armor and no weapon, ran toward the nearest sword pile. 90 seconds remained before contact. Here's what was supposed to happen when a Roman camp was attacked. Trumpets would sound the alarm. Soldiers would race to their unit standards, the eagle poles that marked each century's position. They would grab their armor, strap it on, take their shields and weapons from the stacks, form into centuries of 80 men each. Centuries would form into cohorts of 480. Cohorts would form into legions. Officers would take command. The legion would deploy in the standard 3-line formation. Hastati in front, Principes in the middle, Triarii in reserve. Then they would wait for orders. The whole process, when drilled, took maybe 6 minutes. The Nervii had left the Romans 3 minutes, and that's when Caesar's worst nightmare materialized. The legions couldn't form up. They didn't have time. Soldiers were scattered across a square kilometer. Many couldn't even see their unit standards through the dust and chaos. The trumpet calls were contradictory, different officers issuing different orders. And the Gauls were coming, a wave of iron and fury that would hit the Roman lines in seconds. Think about what that meant in practical terms. The 3rd cohort of the 7th Legion had soldiers scattered across 200 meters of construction site. Their centurion, Marcus Petronius, stood by his unit standard screaming for his men to rally. Maybe 40 of his 80 soldiers could even hear him through the chaos. The others were too far away, or already running to different rally points, or frozen in panic watching the approaching horde. Petronius made a decision that would be repeated by centurions across the entire Roman position. He stopped waiting for his full unit and started forming up whoever reached him first. Soldiers from the 2nd cohort, men from the 5th, even a few from the 8th Legion who'd gotten disoriented. Unit integrity, the foundation of Roman military power, was gone. 2:32, 60 seconds to impact. Across the Roman position, roughly 12,000 soldiers had managed to arm themselves with at least a shield and sword. Maybe 4,000 had some armor on. Helmets, maybe chest plates, rarely both. The rest of the 25,000 Romans on site were still running, still scrambling, still trying to find their equipment in the chaos. And here's where Roman training showed its deepest value. Those 12,000 armed soldiers didn't panic. They formed lines, not proper lines, just 3 or 4 men deep, shields overlapping, swords ready. They formed wherever they happened to be, facing the approaching Nervii, knowing they were about to be overwhelmed, but forming up anyway, because that's what Romans did. The Nervii were 100 meters out, individual faces visible now, warriors screaming, foam on their lips, shields painted with clan symbols, iron-tipped spears leveled. The ground shook from their footfalls. Behind the first rank, maybe 20,000 warriors. Came another rank, and another, and another. A human tsunami that would crash into 12,000 Romans in ragged formation and sweep them away. Caesar reached the 12th Legion's position on the Roman right, grabbed a shield from a dying soldier whose name he'd never learn, drew his gladius, and prepared to fight for his life. At 2:33 p.m., 200,000 Nervii warriors hit the Roman lines, and the Battle of the Sambre began. Julius Caesar was 43 years old, a politician playing general, a man who'd spent more time in the Senate than on battlefields. But when he saw his legions collapsing, saw men in work tunics grabbing whatever weapons they could find and forming up with whoever happened to be next to them regardless of unit, saw the Nervii about to hit them in overwhelming numbers, he did something that defined his entire career. He grabbed a shield from a dying soldier, drew his sword, and ran toward the collapsing right wing where the 12th Legion was being overwhelmed. No bodyguard, no orders shouted to subordinates, just Caesar, sprinting in full general's regalia toward the melee where his legion was dying. Roman soldiers saw him coming, saw their commander running into the death trap with them, and something shifted. The panicked scramble became something else. Not organized, not a proper Roman formation, but men stopped running and started fighting. The right wing was a disaster. The 12th Legion had maybe 2,000 men in some form of combat readiness when the Nervii hit. Against them came roughly 40,000 Nervii warriors, the tribal center, the best fighters in the Confederation. That's a 20-to-1 disadvantage. The math was simple murder. The 12th's lines, 3 and 4 men deep in places, completely broken in others, couldn't hold. Nervii warriors smashed through, shields locked, stabbing with spears, hacking with swords. Roman soldiers fought in clusters, back to back, trying to protect each other, but the Gauls were everywhere. Caesar reached the 12th's position at 2:34 p.m., 1 minute after contact. He could see centurions dying, officers trying to rally their men, cut down in seconds by overwhelming numbers. The 12th's Aquilifer, the soldier carrying the legion's sacred eagle standard, went down with 3 spears in his chest. The eagle, the symbol of Roman honor, fell into the dirt. If the Nervii captured it, the 12th Legion would be officially annihilated, erased from the army rolls, its name struck from history. Here's where Caesar did something that ancient historians still argue about. He didn't take command. He didn't issue orders. He couldn't. The noise of battle drowned out everything. Instead, he fought, personally. Shield up, gladius stabbing, moving into the thickest part of the melee where Nervii warriors were trying to reach the fallen eagle. Roman soldiers near him saw their general, recognizable by his distinctive crimson cloak and gilded armor, fighting like a common legionary. The psychological impact was immediate. If Caesar was willing to die here, then this position could be held. Men who'd been retreating stopped. Men who'd been fighting defensively attacked. A centurion named Baculus, wounded in 4 places, crawled to the fallen eagle and held it upright even though he couldn't stand. Soldiers formed a circle around him and Caesar, shields locked, stabbing at any Gaul who came close. The cluster held, not advancing, not winning, but not breaking either. From that single point of resistance, the 12th Legion began to coalesce. More soldiers rallied, more clusters formed. But holding one position didn't change the overall situation. The 12th was still being overwhelmed. The right wing was still collapsing. And Caesar, trapped in hand-to-hand combat, had no idea what was happening in the rest of his army. For all he knew, Rome's conquest of Gaul was dying around him. Caesar reached the right wing in time to watch it collapse. The 12th Legion, veterans who'd fought through the previous year's campaigns, simply broke. They'd formed up in whatever clusters they could manage, 3 or 4 centuries worth of men in loose formation, when the Nervii hit them. And the Nervii hit like nothing the Romans had faced before. These weren't wild charges. The Gallic warriors smashed into the Roman line with shields locked, fighting in coordinated groups, using their numbers to envelop and overwhelm each Roman cluster. The 12th's senior centurions died in the first 60 seconds, cut down while trying to organize their men. Without officers, without formation, pressed by overwhelming numbers, the 12th did what Roman legions never did. They ran, not a full rout, but a fighting retreat, backing up the hill toward the baggage train, leaving gaps in the Roman line that the Nervii poured through. And now Caesar faced the nightmare scenario. His right wing was collapsing. His left wing was barely holding. His center was engaged in desperate close quarters fighting. And he still had no idea where the rest of his army was, or if they were even alive. 2:36 p.m. The 12th had been in contact for 3 minutes and had already lost approximately 800 men, nearly 20% of its strength. The survivors weren't running in panic. They were backing up in fighting clusters, shields locked, stabbing at pursuing Nervii. But they were backing up. Every meter of ground they yielded opened the Roman flank wider. The Nervii commanders saw it instantly and committed more warriors to exploit the gap. Another 10,000 Gauls poured through where the 12th had been, driving toward the half-constructed Roman camp's interior. Here's what made the situation catastrophic. When a Roman battle line breaks, standard doctrine says adjacent units extend their flanks to close the gap. But there were no adjacent units. The 11th Legion, which should have been to the 12th's left, was still arriving, still forming up, not in position. The gap in the line was 500 meters wide and growing. Through it, Nervii warriors flooded toward the baggage train, where 15,000 camp followers, wives, children, merchants, slaves, were trapped. Caesar, still fighting in the 12th's collapsing position, couldn't see any of this. The dust, the chaos, the press of bodies limited visibility to maybe 20 meters. He knew his right was breaking, but not how fast or how far. He couldn't see the center where the 7th and 8th legions were locked in desperate fighting. He couldn't see the left wing where the 9th and 10th legions faced the Atrebates. He definitely couldn't see the baggage train or know it was about to be overrun. What Caesar didn't know was worse. The Nervii had committed roughly 120,000 warriors to this first assault. They still had 80,000 in reserve, waiting in the forest. If those fresh troops hit the Roman position now, with the 12th broken and the line fractured, it would be total annihilation. But something was happening on the Roman left that would change everything. The 9th Legion, facing impossible odds, was about to do something that shouldn't have been possible. They were counterattacking. Sometimes battles are decided by timing so precise, it seems like divine intervention. The 13th and 14th legions, the newest recruits, the men who'd never seen combat, were an hour behind the main column when the attack began. They heard the roar of battle from kilometers away. Their commander, Titus Labienus, Caesar's second in command, was with the advanced legions and couldn't issue orders. The senior centurions of the 13th and 14th had to make a choice. Follow standard doctrine, which said march to the sound of battle but don't engage until you can assess the situation. Or charge immediately toward what sounded like the complete destruction of the Roman army. They chose to charge. 4,500 men from each legion, 18 cohorts of fresh troops still in full armor because they'd been marching, not making camp, came over the rise and saw the Nervii swarming over the Roman position. And here's where Roman training proved itself. These raw recruits didn't hesitate, didn't stop to gawk at the nightmare in front of them. They deployed into assault formation while moving and hit the Nervii's exposed right flank like a hammer. 2:41 p.m., 11 minutes into the battle. The 13th and 14th crested the ridge overlooking the Sambre Valley and saw hell. Thousands of Nervii warriors were flooding through gaps in the Roman lines. The right wing was collapsing. The center was surrounded. Bodies carpeted the ground. The Romans were losing. Any sane commander would have halted to assess the tactical situation, sent scouts forward, established defensive positions, waited for orders. The Isang, senior centurion of the 13th Legion, a 30-year veteran named Sextus Baculus, made a different calculation. He had 9,000 fresh soldiers in full armor against an enemy that had just spent 11 minutes in exhausting combat. He had surprise. The Nervii weren't expecting reinforcements, and he had maybe 5 minutes before the Roman position collapsed completely. Baculus gave the order: deploy and advance. No waiting, no defensive positions, immediate assault. The 13th and 14th spread from marching column into battle formation. 3 lines deep, cohorts spaced properly, sentries locked, all while moving forward at quick march. It was a drill these men had practiced 1,000 times in training camps across Gaul. They'd just never done it while approaching a battle that would determine whether they lived or died. Here's where it gets genuinely insane. These were the greenest troops in Caesar's army. Most had been in uniform for less than 6 months. They'd never faced combat. They'd never killed a man. They'd never felt an enemy blade trying to find the gaps in their armor. But they marched toward the Nervii with parade ground precision because Roman training ran deeper than experience. The muscle memory was there. The formation discipline was there. The conditioning to obey orders and trust the man next to you was there. The Nervii on the right flank, approximately 30,000 warriors pursuing the broken 12th Legion, suddenly saw 9,000 fresh Romans in perfect formation, crashing into their exposed side. Warriors who'd been running forward had to stop, turn, try to form defensive positions. But they were scattered from the pursuit, disorganized from combat, facing the wrong direction. The 13th and 14th hit them at 2:43 p.m., and the tactical situation reversed in seconds. The Nervii had made one critical error, and it was about to cost them everything. They'd committed their entire force to the initial assault. All 200,000 warriors were swarming across the Roman position, seeking total annihilation. No reserve, no troops held back to respond to threats. Every man was pushing forward, climbing over the half-dug ramparts, fighting in the gaps between Roman units, pursuing the 12th Legion up the hill. They'd achieved what should have been impossible, catching a Roman army unprepared and breaking it. But they'd forgotten a basic principle that every successful military commander learns. You need a reserve. When the 13th and 14th Legions hit their right flank, there was no one to respond. The Nervii warriors on that flank turned to face the new threat, which meant they stopped pushing forward in the center. The pressure on the 7th and 8th Legions suddenly eased. and Caesar, bloodied and exhausted, saw his chance. Think about what this meant tactically. The Nervii had achieved total surprise and numerical superiority at the point of contact, 6-to-1 advantage across the battlefield. But advantages mean nothing if you can't exploit them. Military doctrine since Alexander the Great said the same thing. Commit enough force to break the enemy, but hold back reserves to respond to unexpected developments. The Nervii, in their fury to annihilate the Romans completely, had violated this principle. Every single warrior was engaged. When the 13th and 14th appeared on their flank, there was no one to redirect, no fresh troops to counter the threat. 2:44 p.m. The Nervii right flank, 30,000 warriors who'd been pursuing the 12th Legion, suddenly found themselves fighting for survival against 9,000 Romans in perfect formation. The Gauls tried to form defensive lines, but they were scattered, exhausted from 11 minutes of combat, facing troops who were fresh and organized. The 13th and 14th drove through them like a spear through flesh. Nervii warriors went down in heaps. The clan formations that had worked so perfectly in the assault shattered under coordinated Roman sword work. Here's where the cascading failure began. The Nervii center, 60,000 warriors engaged with the 7th and 8th legions, saw their right flank collapsing. Chieftains started pulling warriors from the center attack to shore up the failing flank. That meant fewer warriors pressing the Roman center. That meant the 7th and 8th, who'd been fighting desperately just to survive, suddenly had room to breathe. Centurions across both legions saw it. The pressure was easing. The Nervii were looking over their shoulders instead of pushing forward. Caesar, still fighting in the 12th Legion's position, saw Nervii warriors hesitating, saw them stopping their pursuit to look toward the sound of battle on their flank. He didn't need perfect intelligence to understand what was happening. Reinforcements had arrived. The tactical situation was shifting. He grabbed the nearest cornicean, a trumpeter, and screamed an order. Sound the advance, not just for the 12th, for every Roman legion that could hear it. At 2:45 p.m., 14 minutes into the battle that should have destroyed Rome's presence in Gaul, Julius Caesar's army stopped retreating and began to counterattack. What happened next was Roman warfare at its most brutally efficient. The 13th and 14th legions drove into the Nervii's flank in perfect formation, gladi stabbing, shields locked, moving like a machine. They cut through the tribal warriors in minutes. Warriors who were facing the wrong direction, warriors who were scattered and disorganized from the pursuit. Meanwhile, the 7th and 8th legions, veterans who'd been barely holding, suddenly counterattacked. They reformed, re-established their lines, and pushed forward. The 9th and 10th legions, who'd been engaged in desperate defensive fighting, now had room to maneuver. They spread out, enveloped the Nervii's left flank. In 17 minutes, the tactical situation completely reversed. The Gauls who'd been overwhelming the Romans suddenly found themselves surrounded, and the Romans, trained for exactly this type of close-quarters butchery, began the killing. 2:46 p.m. The 7th Legion, which had been fighting defensively in loose clusters, suddenly cohered into proper formation. Centuries reformed around their standards. Cohorts established spacing. The three-line formation, Rome's trademark tactical deployment, materialized out of chaos. Once organized, they advanced, not running, not charging, but walking forward in lockstep, shields overlapping, gladi stabbing in coordinated rhythm. This was what Roman legionaries trained for every single day. Advance 3 steps, stab, shield bash, step forward, stab, shield bash, mechanical, efficient, lethal. The Nervii center, which had been pushing into the Roman position, suddenly found Romans advancing toward them from 3 directions. The 7th and 8th from the front, the 13th and 14th from the right, the 9th and 10th spreading to envelop from the left. The Gauls tried to form defensive circles, their standard response to being surrounded. But defensive circles work when you're holding ground and waiting for relief. The Nervii had no relief coming. They'd committed everyone. Here's where Roman training superiority became absolute domination. A Roman legionary with shield and gladius, fighting in formation with men he'd drilled with for years, was the most efficient killing tool in the ancient world. The gladius, short, double-edged, designed for stabbing, could punch through Gallic mail armor at close range. The shield, rectangular, reinforced, held in tight formation, created an advancing wall that tribal warriors couldn't break. And the conditioning, the endless training that made these movements automatic, meant Romans could maintain this mechanical advance for hours while Gallic warriors exhausted themselves trying to stop it. 2:50 p.m., 14 minutes into the Roman counterattack. The Nervii had lost approximately 20,000 warriors, 10% of their force, not wounded, dead. The Romans were taking casualties too, but at maybe 1/5 the Nervii rate. The mathematical reality was becoming clear. The Nervii had achieved surprise, had broken Roman formations, had nearly won. But nearly meant nothing. They were losing now, and losing fast. The Nervii chieftains could see it. Their warriors were being compressed into tighter and tighter spaces, surrounded on 3 sides, the river at their backs, cutting off retreat. Gallic warriors were brave. They'd proven that by charging into what looked like certain Roman victory. But bravery doesn't overcome being surrounded by professional soldiers who are methodically butchering you. At 3:02 p.m., 17 minutes after Caesar sounded the counterattack, the Nervii faced a choice. Retreat across the river and save what remained of their army, or remember the blood oath they'd sworn before the battle. They chose the oath. Here's where the story becomes genuinely horrifying. The Nervii realized they were trapped. Surrounded on 3 sides, the river at their backs, Romans advancing from every direction. Any sane commander would have ordered retreat. Save the army. Live to fight another day. The Nervii refused. They'd sworn an oath before the battle. Annihilate the Romans, or die trying. No retreat, no surrender. And they meant it literally. When the rear ranks saw they were cut off, they didn't run for the river. They formed into tight circles, shields out, and fought until they were killed. When warriors were wounded and couldn't stand, they kept fighting from the ground. When they lost their weapons, they used rocks and fists. Roman accounts describe climbing over heaps of Nervii bodies to reach the next circle of defenders. The slaughter continued for hours. Not a battle, an execution. 3:05 p.m. The Nervii Center, roughly 40,000 warriors still fighting, began forming the defensive circles that would become their mass graves. These weren't panicked clusters. They were organized formations, clan by clan, warriors standing shoulder to shoulder in rings 50 to 100 men across, shields facing outward, spears bristling like a hedgehog. The rear ranks passed weapons forward as the front ranks fell. This was how the Nervii had been taught to die since childhood. The Roman legions surrounded each circle and began the methodical work of annihilation. They didn't charge. They advanced slowly, shields locked, stabbing at any Gaul who exposed himself. When a Nervii warrior fell, Romans pushed forward 1 step, then another step, then another. The circles contracted, tightened, compressed into smaller and smaller spaces as men died and the survivors had nowhere to retreat. Think about what this meant in human terms. A circle of 100 warriors took approximately 20 minutes to destroy completely. The Romans would kill the outer ring, step over the bodies, kill the next ring, step forward again. Men in the center of the circles watched their friends die, knowing they were next, unable to run because the oath forbade it, and because running meant being cut down individually instead of dying with your clan. Some Nervii wounded themselves so they could keep fighting from the ground, stabbing at Roman legs with broken spears. Roman centurions who'd fought in a dozen campaigns said they'd never seen anything like it. Gallic tribes usually broke when casualties hit 20%. The Nervii were at 50% casualties and still fighting. 60%, 70%. Warriors with mortal wounds propped themselves against the bodies of dead comrades and kept swinging swords until blood loss took consciousness. By 4 p.m., 90 minutes into the slaughter, the Nervii had effectively ceased to exist as a military force. Of the 60,000 warriors who'd formed the tribal center, fewer than 5,000 were still standing. They formed one last circle: the chieftains, the clan leaders, the bravest warriors, and prepared for the end. Caesar, watching from his command position, did something that Roman historians still debate. He offered terms. Surrender now, and you'll be allowed to leave with your lives. The Nervii chieftain, Boduanatus, gave an answer that entered Roman legend. We swore an oath to our gods. We keep our oaths. The last circle fell at 4:30 p.m. No survivors. By sunset, the ground along the Sambre River was carpeted with bodies. Roman burial details working in the days afterward counted approximately 200,000 Gallic dead. The Nervii, as a tribe, effectively ceased to exist. Of their 60,000 warriors, Caesar's report claimed fewer than 500 survived. The tribal elders, who'd stayed behind with their council during the battle, sent envoys to Caesar. They showed him a list of 600 nobles who'd led their clans into battle. 3 were still alive. The Atrebates and Viromandui, the allied tribes, were nearly as devastated. Maybe 30,000 survivors from forces that had numbered over 100,000. The Nervii's coalition, assembled to destroy Rome's presence in Gaul, had been annihilated. Roman casualties were catastrophic by their standards, but miraculously light given the situation. The 7th and 8th legions lost approximately 40% of their strength. Maybe 3,600 men dead or critically wounded from 9,000 engaged. The 12th legion, which had broken and run, lost almost 60%, 5,400 men. The other legions lost between 10 and 20%. Total Roman casualties approached 10,000 dead or wounded, from 50,000 engaged. 1 in 5. Painful but survivable. The Gauls lost 2 in 3. Let those numbers sink in for a moment. 200,000 dead in a single afternoon. To put that in perspective, that's more battle deaths than the Americans suffered in the entire Revolutionary War. That's roughly equivalent to killing every single person in a major ancient city, Alexandria, Carthage, Athens, in 4 hours. The scale of slaughter was almost incomprehensible, even to the Romans who'd caused it. The battlefield was a vision of hell. Bodies lay in heaps where the Nervii defensive circles had made their final stands, piles of corpses 6 and 7 men deep. Blood pooled in the half-dug Roman ditches, turning them into crimson trenches. The Sambre River ran red for 3 days, choked with bodies that had floated downstream. Roman soldiers detailed to burial duty, the grim work of preventing disease, couldn't process the dead fast enough. They burned thousands of Gallic corpses in massive pyres that lit the night sky for a week. Here's what made the casualty disparity genuinely shocking. The Romans, caught completely by surprise, half-dressed, scattered across a construction site, facing 6-to-1 odds, still killed 20 Gauls for every Roman who died. That ratio wasn't luck. It was the result of superior training, superior equipment, superior doctrine, and the discipline to execute that doctrine, even under impossible circumstances. The Nervii had done everything right. Ambush, surprise, overwhelming numbers, perfect timing. And they'd still been annihilated. The demographic consequences were catastrophic. The Nervii had sent essentially every fighting-age male to the Sambre. With 99% casualties among warriors, the tribe had no military capacity left. No warriors to defend their territory. No young men to hunt, farm, or continue family lines. The Nervii as a people would never recover. Within a generation, they'd be absorbed into other tribes, their language forgotten, their customs abandoned. They'd chosen extinction over surrender. Caesar, surveying the carnage, understood what he'd witnessed. This wasn't just a military victory. This was a message to every tribe in Gaul. Rome could be surprised, could be caught unprepared, could face impossible odds, and would still win. The question was whether the other Gallic tribes would learn that lesson. The Battle of the Sambre should have destroyed Caesar's army and ended Rome's conquest of Gaul before it truly began. Instead, it became the moment that established Caesar as a military genius and broke Gallic resistance in the north. The Nervii had done everything right. They'd assembled overwhelming force. They'd caught the Romans at their most vulnerable moment. They'd achieved surprise and hit hard enough to break veteran legions. And they'd still lost. The reasons why became Roman military doctrine for centuries. First, Roman training was so ingrained that soldiers could fight effectively even without officers or organized units. When the camp was attacked, men grabbed the nearest weapons and formed up with whoever was nearby. It shouldn't have worked, but the training was deep enough that it did. Second, Caesar's personal courage rallied his men at the critical moment. Ancient warfare was about morale as much as tactics, and seeing their general fighting beside them stopped the collapse. Third, and most critically, the 13th and 14th Legion's arrival at the perfect moment showed that Roman doctrine of marching in separated groups actually provided built-in reinforcement. The Nervii had thought they were ambushing Caesar's entire army. They'd ambushed 2/3 of it. The last third arrived just in time to save the rest. Within weeks, news of the Sambre spread across Gaul. The story that traveled wasn't just Rome defeated the Nervii. It was the Nervii caught Caesar completely by surprise with 6-to-1 numerical advantage and were still annihilated. Think about what that meant for Gallic morale. Every tribe that had been considering resistance suddenly had to recalculate. If the Nervii, the most fearsome warriors in northern Gaul, couldn't defeat Rome even with perfect ambush conditions, what chance did anyone else have? The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Within a month, 9 major tribes sent envoys to Caesar requesting peace terms. Not treaties, not alliances, unconditional surrender. The Atuatuci, who'd been marching to join the Nervii with 30,000 warriors, turned around, went home, and sent gifts to Caesar instead. The entire Belgian Confederation, which had been preparing for war, dissolved overnight. Northern Gaul, which should have taken years to pacify, submitted without another major battle. Here's what the ancient sources don't emphasize enough. The Sambre fundamentally changed how Rome thought about training and doctrine. Before this battle, Roman military theory assumed proper formation and officer command were essential to victory. The Sambre proved that training could substitute for organization when necessary. Soldiers who drilled together for months could fight effectively, even in chaos. This realization influenced Roman military training for the next 5 centuries. The emphasis on repetitive drill, on making battlefield movements automatic, on training until every legionary could function as part of a formation without thinking. All of this was validated at the Sambre. Caesar's reputation transformed overnight. Before the Sambre, he was a political general, a senator playing soldier to build his career. After the Sambre, he was a military genius who'd snatched victory from certain annihilation through personal courage and tactical brilliance. The Senate, which had been skeptical of his Gallic campaigns, suddenly authorized more legions and more funding. His political enemies in Rome found their criticisms dismissed. The man who'd nearly lost his entire army in an ambush became untouchable. But here's the most important consequence, the one that changed Western history. The Sambre secured Roman control of northern Gaul, which gave Caesar the base he needed for the next 6 years of campaigning. Without this victory, there's no conquest of Gaul. Without the conquest of Gaul, Caesar doesn't return to Rome with battle-hardened legions loyal to him personally. Without those legions, there's no crossing of the Rubicon, no civil war, no Roman Empire. The battle that almost destroyed Julius Caesar instead made him emperor of the known world. Let's step back and understand what actually happened at the Sambre River on June 10th, 57 BC. 50,000 Roman soldiers, caught making camp, half-dressed, scattered across a construction site, faced 330,000 Gallic warriors in a perfect ambush. The Romans had 3 minutes to react. Their formations collapsed. Their right wing broke and ran. Their general fought in hand-to-hand combat just to survive. By every military calculation, they should have been annihilated. Instead, in 4 hours of fighting, they killed 200,000 Gauls and lost 10,000 of their own. A 20-to-1 kill ratio under the worst possible tactical circumstances. The largest tribal coalition ever assembled in Gaul was destroyed so completely that the Nervii ceased to exist as a people. The strategic consequences reshaped Western civilization. The Sambre secured northern Gaul for Rome, which gave Caesar the territory and resources he needed to conquer the rest of Gaul over the next 6 years. That conquest brought 3 million Gauls under Roman rule, extended Rome's borders to the Rhine and the Atlantic, and generated the wealth that funded Caesar's later civil war. Without the Sambre, there's no Gallic conquest. Without the Gallic conquest, there's no Roman Empire as we know it. The language you're hearing right now, English, exists because Rome conquered Gaul, and Latin evolved into French, which invaded Britain with William the Conqueror in 1066. But here's what makes this battle genuinely important beyond the strategic consequences. The Sambre proved that training and discipline could overcome impossible odds. 50,000 men survived and won because their training was so deeply ingrained that they could fight effectively even when every tactical advantage had been stripped away. No proper formations, no time to organize, no clear chain of command, just soldiers who drilled together so many times that fighting in formation had become instinct. The Nervii had courage, they had numbers, they had perfect tactical surprise. They fought with a fanaticism that made Roman veterans say they'd never seen anything like it. And they still lost because courage without discipline, numbers without coordination, and surprise without the ability to exploit it, none of it could overcome soldiers who trained to function as a machine, even in chaos. That's the lesson commanders have learned and relearned for 2,000 years. You don't rise to the occasion in combat. You fall to the level of your training. At the Sambre, Roman training proved unbreakable even at the breaking point. 50,000 men survived the unsurvivable because when chaos came, they didn't have to think. They just had to fight. And that made all the difference.